Edify means to enlighten, encourage, and uplift individuals, intellectually, morally, and spiritually. That's exactly what our EDIFY Podcast guests do, as they share practical wisdom on living our faith in public. I'm Mary Fiorito. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the EDIFY Podcast. Our guest today is Erika Bachiochi. Erika is a legal scholar specializing in equal protection jurisprudence, feminist legal theory, Catholic social teaching, and sexual ethics. Welcome, Erika. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Mary. It's wonderful to be with you.
Well, it's terrific. I'm so interested in all of your work for a multitude of reasons, but one, because you're a fellow lawyer mom but you have twice as many children as I do. And what I always find so interesting about your work, Erika, is that you're a convert to the pro-life position.
It's true.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I grew up in a home. I was baptized Catholic, but then my mom was married and divorced 3 times. So by the time I reached my 19th birthday, I'd also lost 2 friends to suicide. So you can say that my early teenage years were incredibly emotionally tumultuous and kind of acted out in many ways, as you can imagine. And so by the time I got to college, I found myself very quickly in the Women's Center. I was a college athlete, but really sort of found solidarity with the feminists on campus. I was at Middlebury College in Vermont, very, very liberal.
What was your sport?
Liberal school. I was a soccer player at Middlebury. And of course, Senator, then Congressman Bernie Sanders was our beloved representative there in Vermont. So I was a big fan, called myself a socialist or radical feminist at that point. And so it was very much, sort of obviously pro-choice. That just sort of came with the drinking
That's
water.
with the whole package, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So but what's fascinating about it is, and I think really beautiful, is that I had by that time really at the end of high school, because of the suicides, had really found myself, I guess you could just say, had fallen to my knees and found myself in 12-step meetings. And so began kind of a recovery and really a real dependence upon God as I understood God.
And this is still as an undergrad.
And this is actually before I got to college. So then when I got to college, I kind of had already started praying. I had sort of this spiritual life. I was very into kind of new age spirituality, very anti-Christian at that point. And so that was sort of going, hand in glove with my feminism. But I was praying, and that's sort of the essential point, I think, is that the prayer really, I think, opened me up. The prayer and the suffering really, and the anxiety and all the stuff that I was sort of enduring because of a lot of the emotional devastation of my, youth. Prayer was really my stronghold. And so I sort of went more deeply into that, I guess you could say. And so found myself down in Washington, D.C., was working on welfare reform, and a bunch of different things happened that kind of, again, I think really grace opened my heart and my mind enough to see things that I really believe, had I not been praying, maybe I wouldn't have been open to. So the 2 really important things that happened was that my professor down in D.C. Assigned lots of constitutional law, but then also Marianne Glendon's work, especially her book Rights Talk, and some other kind of communitarians. They weren't like fully Catholic thinkers.
Right.
But,
so for our listeners who aren't familiar with Marianne Glendon, she is the now retired learned hand professor of constitutional law at Harvard.
That's right.
Harvard University Law School.
Right. So then the second thing that happened, which all of your listeners I'm sure will appreciate, was that my professor, so really I was down there, I was studying, I think that, some people go abroad for their junior year. So I went down to DC, was very interested in politics. So I was at American University, and the professor would bring in different perspectives on sort of the contentious issues of the day. So, you had a pro and anti-gun rights, you had free speech questions. Well, you had abortion. And who was the pro-life speaker but the great Helen Alvare? So Helen at that point was working for the bishops. And I have to tell you, I don't remember a single thing she said, but she had both a beauty and generosity and joy to her that was something I was craving in my own life. And so then the pro-choice woman came in and was, angry and a bit irrational, and was all the things I didn't want in my life. And though I agreed with the pro-choicer, it really opened me up to the pro-life views. When you have sort of Helen's kind of persona And then Marianne Glendon's kind of the arguments she made in that book, Rights Talk, really entirely opened my mind up to kind of the pro-life way.
Right.
And the final kind of, leg on the stool is that because of the care that I'd received in my 12-step meetings and all that, I really understood at kind of a deep, deep way that this personal connection, personal care of those who are suffering, and that's really, the pro-life way, was something that was what brought healing. And it made a lot of sense to me that would be the way forward for a woman, like not to just kind of, as Marianne Glendon says, like leave her with her legal autonomy and nothing else, but really kind of join her in solidarity and be with her what those kind people in those meetings were for me. And so it began to make a lot of sense. Anyway, it opened me up. I went back to Middlebury and really, shifted out of women's studies and sociology and started studying political philosophy. And it was there that both in reading the ancients, Plato and Aristotle, but then also meeting really, Catholics on campus, Christians and Catholics on campus who challenged me in a lot of ways, but they lived beautiful lives. And that was really kind of, I think, enduringly significant that it was people's lives that were much more than arguments, though arguments were important too for me. And reading kind of my way in through C.S. Lewis and others, but people's lives and their hospitality and all that was, I think, really what brought me back.
How did you meet your husband?
Well, that's another very fascinating story. So I ended up after Middlebury going to Boston College for 2 years to study theology for a master's, which is kind of funny. I just had to do sort of all of my theological training in 2 years. And at BC, I had some really wonderful, very orthodox professors there. And while I was there, I decided sort of through prayer, I at that point was attending daily mass, that I wanted to give up men for Lent. Now that sounds as though I had all sorts of dates, which I did not, but I just wanted to give up. When you become Catholic.
Thinking about them all the time and worried if someone was going to ask you out. That's a fascinating penance. I have never thought of that.
When you become Catholic, there's like this romantic feel, oh my gosh, Catholic marriage,
and I'm going to be
Catholic
in the chapel
motherhood,
and someone will walk in
right, and it's right, and my whole life will be. Well, anyway, I needed to give it up because it was really that kind of romanticism.
Once you're single, that can consume a lot of your thinking, and your prayer life.
That's
right. I totally get that.
Yeah, so I put my heart in the tabernacle every day, and so right before Lent started, I met this lovely man who would become my husband, but I decided, no, I'm not gonna flirt with him. I'm not gonna go out with him. And I told him.
So was he at Boston College as well?
No, he was, he had been working for the NSA, came back up to be close to home and was working for IBM at that point, and then just came to a mass. So we met at a mass actually in this chapel that I'd prayed, beautiful stone chapel there at St. Mary's at BC. And so we became friends. So I said, okay, I think it's all right if we talk on the phone, but I'm not going to flirt, which I didn't. So I became friends, and it was perfectly what I needed because I would have messed the whole thing up had we become romantic right away or something because of my past. So I was really able for those 40 days to get to know a man who was incredibly generous-hearted and just a good, virtuous man. I don't know that I would have been attracted to him had I not, because of my kind of brokenness. And so I really, and over the course of now we've been married 21 years, have 7 children. He's really been a rock. And it's amazing in marriage to have someone love you despite yourself for all that time is sort of the image of how God loves us. And it's a real beautiful solace. And it brings about a lot of healing for people, I think, who had sort of broken childhoods like mine.
Yeah, I wish that we could take this last 3 minutes of the conversation and make sure that every girl who's a high school senior can hear it, because I think there's a lot of woundedness among young women today in particular. And, some of your work, while it doesn't address that maybe directly, indirectly points to the causes of that. So how did you, decide to write this book on Wollstonecraft? I guess you would kind of think, gosh, that's really random. Like, how did you pick this person out of all the women in feminist history and focus on her?
Yeah, well, that has its own backstory. I mean, a lot of the work I had done before was looking at the way in which the abortion-backed contraceptive revolution change sexual norms, change sexual ethics to the detriment of women.
Right.
And so I'd done some work in constitutional law, looking at, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's arguments, but really the entire sort of all the feminist legal literature on the idea that abortion is necessary for women's equality. So I, did a lot of sort of deep constitutional law work on that. And so what those two things together made me realize I wanted to do was kind of go back to my the background, the really rich work I'd done at the end of undergrad, but then also in graduate school and then in law school, was thinking more about political theory and rights theory. So I wanted to understand, how is it that you could have a woman, someone like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but really all of these, these feminists of our time, who could think that it was possible to say that women could have a right to end the life of her own child. It didn't make sense to me as an issue of rights. So I wanted to get behind their arguments and try to get back to what were the philosophical kind of presuppositions that enabled that kind of insight to happen,
Right.
or actual not insight, but and so that's where I said, God, I've got to, and so every, pro-lifer, especially pro-life feminists, know that, the original suffragists of our country were, without known exception, opposed to abortion. We kind of know that. We know the quotes. I wanted to get into their thought, like how they thought about rights, how they grounded rights in their own, like in Seneca Falls and their own work, and then also like who influenced them. And so that's where I got back to the late 18th century British philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft. And so in her Vindication of the Rights of Woman.
So what is that? Can you just explain
Yeah.
to the listeners who might not be familiar with her at
so
all?
she's a really kind of controversial thinker because
And she was English.
Yeah, she's an English woman, and self-taught philosopher. And so, there's all sorts of things to say about her, but she, part of why, I think there's not a lot of attention to her is because she sort of fell from grace, you could say, because of some things that happened in her own life. So she's a figure that's a complicated figure. And so I think a lot of conservatives maybe haven't wanted to touch her for that reason. But I think if you go and read A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, you find in there an approach to rights that is grounded in natural law. And even reading through the book, what you find is that there's very little talk about rights and there's all sorts of talk about virtue. And so what she is actually saying is that rights are necessary for us to virtuously carry out our duties. And so really duties and responsibilities are the first reality of human beings. Our duties to self, to
others.
But to self, and this is an important point because what she says is that we have to live according to the highest principle in us, which is our reason, right? Because we're created as rational creatures, and both men and women are rational creatures. And so that what reason does is it allows us to order our appetites, and it's a very ancient view. And so we have to make sure that we're doing that, and that's part of our responsibility to ourself and to develop our capacities, our rational capacities, so that passions don't overtake us, because that would be like to live as animals. Right. And that's really where she sees one of the things she really talks a lot about is the want of male chastity or the lack of male chastity. That chastity was a virtue only expected of women, not expected of men. And yet both men and women should really fulfill all of the virtues, should be called all of the virtues to be fully human. And so it's a really, I think, beautiful text and a helpful way for us to kind of reclaim a rights tradition that is built upon our ends as human beings, which is to live virtuous lives, to try to grow in wisdom. And those were her goals as well. So that's where I think, especially for a very secular world, that sometimes we can't go, with our Catholic social teaching, beating people over the head, it doesn't work so well. But to use these philosophical arguments, I think is incredibly helpful.
Where did women read this?
Yeah, so Vindication of the Rights of Woman, so again, 1792, and it made its way over to the United States. And so it was very influential. Actually, Abigail Adams calls herself Wollstonecraft's pupil. Abigail and John Adams actually were in the same congregation as Mary Wollstonecraft back in England when
Religious
John,
congregation.
That's right. That's right. Unitarians, when Unitarians actually meant something.
Right.
Yeah. And that's its big, long story that we don't have time for, but that you can read about in the book. And then she was very influential over Lucretia Mott, who read her book in 1820. Lucretia Mott was really one of the leading abolitionist thinkers, but then also an advocate for women's rights, but also had this real strong sense that if women understood themselves as capable of great virtue, and had the right to then live out, and whether it's in the professions or in public life, this would have a great impact on the country, right?
So reproductive justice, obviously we're hearing a lot of that lately because of the Dobbs decision and the overturning of Roe and Casey. How would you describe what the church would see as true reproductive justice?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's a great framing too. The way we think about it is both kind of prenatal and reproductive justice. We really, I'm just going to say it, but the church and sort of a more ancient tradition really knows a lot more of what the word justice means than what we today sort of hear justice bantied about, right? So justice is asking what we owe one another. And so when you think about it in reproductive terms, you think, well, what is it that we owe one another when it comes to the human being in the womb? Well, we owe that human being, well, protection, right? The protection of its life. But then what is, so that's what the mother owes that human being, her child in her womb, growing in her womb, developing in her womb. But then the father's sort of left out a lot of times, but clearly the father owes the mother something and owes the child something. So what is that something that is owed, right? And then also society at large, I think, also owes that triad, which obviously sometimes when the father abandons the two, then it's owing that child and its mother something too. And so the question is like, what is it that's owed, And so what we as Catholics think is like radical solidarity, right? It's care, it's nurture, it's seeing that it is hard to be a woman who, in any pregnancy is hard, but that woman, when she is pregnant, becomes more vulnerable when she's taking care of that vulnerable child. She becomes more dependent. And so there are others who have to step in and then care for her life, care for her, especially if she has some sort of life-threatening or health-threatening or any type of condition, or is poor, or is, all of these things, like we as a community, as a church community, and I think as a political community, owe it to all of them to ensure that they have what they need to carry out their duties, right? So if we believe that the mother has a duty to care for her child, well, how do we help her carry out her duties? And that to me is what a really just politics, a just economy looks like, is helping people carry out their duties.
Right. Well, so here's the other big, I guess, sort of philosophical term that is we're finding really the almost the primary one that the pro-choice movement is imposing on us, forced birthers, as they call us, is this understanding of autonomy. So how does autonomy, as they understand it, as those who support legal abortion, how does that actually undermine their own argument when they talk about the woman as being a completely autonomous? And how does that play? How do we flip the tables on them to show them how autonomy actually harms women rather than helping them?
Yeah. It's an interesting question, because obviously we all want some measure of autonomy, right? We all believe that we have agency, we govern our lives, right? As the protagonists in our life. We also don't want anyone coming and harming us or touching us without our consent. So there is some measure of autonomy, but if you look etymologically, what does autonomy mean? But it's a rule of oneself. So it's like this idea that we sort of we're the only ones who decide ultimately what our life is all about. And so it's entirely detached from sort of a greater meaning or greater purpose or something that we are part of, right? And the real problem, I think, is this idea that, when you think about just being autonomous, either entirely ruling yourself or, there's this idea of kind of we're alone on an island all by ourselves. And what it brings to mind philosophically, and this maybe gets too much into the weeds, is really not someone like a Mary Wollstonecraft who really understood human beings as very fundamentally interconnected. But it gets instead to these like the Enlightenment thinker myths of origin of, Thomas Hobbes or John Locke, and those who really see the human being as a solitary being first and foremost. And so when you think about a women's rights movement that follows in this tradition of autonomy, it's really kind of mimicking this alone being all by himself. And I want to put the emphasis on himself, because the idea is what's emphasized is a really male-bodied, because a male-bodied person, a man, can kind of pretend he's autonomous. He can engage in the same sexual act as a woman, and he can walk away physically from that and pretend that there are no consequences to that act. Right. But when a woman engages in that same sexual act, in order to be autonomous, she has to engage in a life-destroying act. And so it is like imitating the worst sort of man, the man who is literally abandoning his child, to think that, and that's how women attain equality. So it's really very much, and you see this in the dissent in Dobbs, that equality is attained through autonomy. And what is autonomy but the imitation of kind of this child-abandoning man? So it's really kind of the lowest possible idea of equality, when
Why would women want that?
Exactly.
That sounds horrible.
So there's another way of thinking about equality, right? So you can bring everyone down to this sort of awful man, or you can say, why doesn't everyone, and this is how Wollstonecraft, or certainly the first women's rights advocates in our country, would have said, why don't we invite men to join women in the act of nurture and care and reciprocity and responsibility to that child. Right. And of course, marriage is the most obvious thing. Right. And so that's where equality, in terms of equality of solidarity or equality of care and all of that, and just that we're equal, obviously, by nature as children of God, that we don't have to sort of prove ourselves out there in the world, but that we're equally loved and equally dependent upon God.
Right. You have 7 children. How do you balance all the responsibilities of work and home and do the very important work that you're doing?
Yeah, it's sort of always the question for me.
Well, I think for so many women, right? It's the one thing we all either feel guilty about or we struggle with. Right. And, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say is that there's this historical problem where we all think of this as like each individual woman or even man's problem. And I would actually just send listeners to an article I wrote that is kind of from the book. So if you're not going to go read the 400-page book, but it's called Pursuing the Reunification of Home and Work, because this is a post-industrial problem. So think about, just to give a bit of a history, which all of us know, but you think about, pre-industrial economies were household based. And so men and women work together in the household, obviously men far more outside of the household and women inside the household, but they were both doing the work of caring for children together. Mm-hmm. And then industrialization pulls men out of the home and they become wage earners and dependent upon, the capitalist industrialist. And then women suddenly become really dependent on the wage earning men when all of them before that had been very interdependent. And so we're in this kind of place where we have this very kind of post-industrial way of thinking about work that I think COVID has kind of helped us to kind of maybe reassess the way we do work and home. So it's funny, I think of the way my children talk about when they've like done, reports on how does my mom think about home and work and how does she all do this? I think the insight that my eldest saw was that I really see all the work I do as just sort of kind of all of a piece. Like I see my work at home as just as much work as I see my work outside of the home. And so the question is, what takes priority at this moment, right? And so it's not as though, I got to get all that work at home done in order to do this really important work I do outside the home. No, it's all fodder for my own sanctification, but then the sanctification of others as well. And so how is it that I could be an instrument? And so God has first and foremost given me a vocation to marriage and a vocation to care for these children. And so that always has to be my priority. But then how is it that I can use my time well in order to serve others outside in the world? And so I have to be very disciplined, and I have to ensure that I don't say yes to every possible thing. And I have to also really see where I can push, when people ask me, especially say for media appearances, I'm not as good at media. Mary, in fact, is much better at media. So I try to push things off to other people so that I can really focus on scholarship, because that's where I tend to have more gifts.
Right.
And so it's just, we don't want to be all things to all people. We really want to see, where is God calling me specifically to? And so that's how I've tried to respond.
Well, as we're wrapping up here, I'd like to ask if you can talk a little bit about your prayer life. Do you have any particular female saints you really like, who you turn to for inspiration and intercession?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would have to say, my really important things that I do for prayer: try to get to Mass every day, try to pray the Rosary every day, try to have a time of mental prayer every day. And as someone who was very strongly feminist and then came back to the church, Our Lady has been kind of a thing that I've, and because I don't have a great relationship with my mother, frankly, but there's been a way in which Mary has drawn me to her in more recent years.
Interesting.
And so even though I've been praying the Rosary every day for 2 decades now, there's a way that, and I'll tell you, it's been especially with regard to this book, because I was very confident doing the scholarship and writing the book, not as confident doing the media. And I just really said, and promoting the book, because doesn't come as naturally to me. And so I said, Mary, take this. And it's been this unfolding of seeing the care she has for me in this way. Mm. So I've really, I think, drawn more closely to Mary in the last couple of years, and really very much kind of admire her fiat and the kind of docility, I think is something that I really try to carry out as much as I can in my own life.
See, that really surprises me. Not that I ever thought you didn't love Our Lady, but I thought you were going to say Edith Stein or one of the great scholar philosophers, or Catherine of Siena or something. So that's a really interesting perspective, and I think for a lot of people would be a different way to think about Our Lady and how she might intercede and help us. So, well, Erika Bachiochi, thank you so much for edifying us so that we can in turn edify America. And listeners, again, if you'd like to read Erika's book, it's The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision. Where would you rather that people purchase the book?
Well, if you go to Notre Dame Press, that's always good.
Right.
But of course, if you go to Amazon, leave a review. That's always good.
Yes, please do. Well, Erika, thank you. So, your time is very valuable, and thank you for sharing it so much of it with our listeners today.
Thank you, Mary, for having me.
Thank you for listening. To make it easier for you to listen to future EDIFY Podcast episodes, please make sure you subscribe over at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Thank you.